Great. Yes. So thanks for inviting me to speak as part of this series. It's really exciting work that's being done at the moment, and it's been fantastic to collaborate with the Monash eResearch group as well, and Zongwan, who's a co-chair today. So thanks very much for the invitation. So our interest is obviously in skin cancer, and particularly skin cancer diagnostics. But there are some other applications for AI in dermatology, which we will I'll touch on. So just a bit of background to really understand, because a lot of the participants today, I think, don't have a clinical background. So the current state of play for melanoma, essentially it's seen as Australia's cancer. It's very common cancer within Australia, the third most common in males and females. And it's also a very costly cancer to the healthcare system. So skin cancer is, in fact, the most costly cancer to the healthcare system. There's no population-based screening program, and screening really tends to be on quite an ad hoc basis or opportunistic. And the reason for the lack of a population-based screening program is there's really no evidence to improve that it would improve mortality, and it comes with risks of increased overdiagnosis and also morbidity from potentially a lot of unnecessary biopsies on top of what we already see. There's really no randomized control evidence to prove benefit. There was one study that had some seed funding in Queensland, but was aborted due to lack of ongoing funding some years ago, and hasn't been attempted again. Although there is some appetite to revisit that with a more targeted approach. So surveillance strategies really tend to vary amongst practitioners. There are a number of skin cancer clinics and as well as dermatologists and general practitioners that do practice in the realm of skin cancer. Over the years, there's been an increase in the rate of in the number of diagnoses of in situ disease, really without a corresponding drop in mortality. So there is likely a degree of overdiagnosis in what we're picking up clinically. And diagnostic accuracy is variable. It really does depend on the experience of the treating doctor. With variable benign to malignant ratios from about 3 benign lesions needing to be excised for every melanoma detected to over 30 to 1 in some situations, so quite variable. There's a significant challenge that we face when we see patients. So we commonly get patients who are high risk that have a lot of different moles, which can be common moles, can be atypical moles, which are slightly larger, and can have some slightly unusual dermoscopic features. And these are some examples. And the patient on the right that you can see has had a lot of excisions. That's a picture courtesy of Peter Sawyer in Queensland, but very common situation that we see here in Victoria as well. And so really the challenge for us is to avoid this situation where patients are feeling that they need to get lots and lots of moles removed to reduce their risk, because in fact most melanomas arise as a new lesion rather than a change in a pre-existing lesion. And so we spend quite a lot of time reassuring patients, or trying to reassure them, that removing all of their moles is not in fact preventive. It's not what we would recommend, and that really we prefer to monitor things well with imaging. So how do we diagnose melanoma? We've had for some time the ABCD rule, which you've probably all heard and are somewhat familiar with, and that lets us assess most melanomas fairly well. It doesn't fit all melanomas. There are some, particularly nodular melanomas, that can be a smaller diameter and quite symmetrical, in fact, and can be just pink or skin coloured, and so much more difficult to diagnose. But the vast majority conform to this ABCD criteria. And the other thing is that we look for whether they've been evolving, so changing with time. So that's really an important point. And as I said before, most melanomas actually arise as a completely new lesion rather than as a change in a pre-existing mole. So it's a really good baseline thing to do is to take some good images of the whole skin surface to get an idea of their whole skin, so that we can see if any lesions are new, in fact. So the principles for imaging for surveillance include sequential dermoscopic imaging, and I'll show you some examples of dermoscopic imaging. And if there are lesions that we feel and don't quite reach the diagnostic criteria for melanoma, we might monitor them for a short-term period over usually 3 months. And in higher risk patients, we might monitor some of the larger lesions over longer periods of time. We combine that with total body photography, which enables us to pick up any new lesions that might be arising in previously unblemished skin. So the combination of those two really is useful in improving our diagnostic accuracy and reducing those unnecessary excisions. It's also quite useful for patients to have access to those so that they can refer to them when they're examining their own skin. So it's interesting, just for the purposes of understanding some of the pitfalls of AI, I think, is to understand how imaging data has evolved over time. And some of the early dermoscopes that were developed back in the 50s were pretty rudimentary, as you can see. And I found this image from an early publication in the 50s, which I don't know if you can see that, but they used a modified portable television microscope, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then things developed from there. So we had non-polarized dermoscopy to start with, and then some polarized light. And then the newer dermoscopes, you can switch between non-polarized and polarized light, which will just give you a slightly different image of the skin and will allow you to visualize different structures, vessels and scarring and so on within the skin a little bit better. So really dermoscopy was a little bit slow to take off, and actually still some of the older generation dermatologists may not use them, particularly in the US. Actually, I was interested to speak to some of my colleagues in the US who said that dermoscopy is not widely used by all dermatologists, whereas in Australia it's really taught as part of our training curriculum and is used very across the board, really. They have been shown to improve our diagnostic odds ratio compared to just naked eye assessment alone, and really most of us feel pretty naked without them when we're seeing our patients. So we do use sequential dermoscopy. So sequential dermoscopy is when we'll follow individual lesions over time. So we might be seeing patients that are high risk every 6 months or every 12 months perhaps, and taking images of their individual lesions over time. Some people might have a couple of lesions that are imaged like this, and others will have quite a number of them. It's a time-consuming task doing that, but for high-risk individuals, it is quite reassuring. And you can see that there can be some subtle changes in a melanoma. I think that's a fairly subtle melanoma up the top there, that example, and then the benign lesion down the bottom has remained fairly stable. But you can see how, even from these two examples, a clinical assessment can really be quite subjective, and that borderline lesions can be reasonably featureless as well. So when you think of a patient who is covered in these lesions, you can see how challenging it can be. So total body photography is used by a number of dermatologists in particular, but again is not taken up across the board. We tend to use it for our high-risk individuals who are covered in lots and lots of moles, and this sort of technology has developed with time as well. So this was one of the first reports to show benefit of the use of total body photography, written by John Kelly, who works with us at the Melanoma Service. And 2D photography has very much been the standard for the last 20 years or so, and patients have typically sort of 15 to 20 body shots taken, and they're given those images in a booklet, which they usually hide in their bottom drawer until their next appointment. And then we have much fancier equipment coming out these days. This is a Vectra machine which has 92 cameras installed around the arches, and will instantaneously take images that will capture the entire skin surface, which are then stitched together to create an avatar of the individual, which has really very good resolution. You can zoom right up and see individual pores on the skin surface, and zoom up on individual moles, which is really exciting. So we are embarking on a project to use a network, or to develop a network of these 3D imaging systems across the Eastern Seaboard as part of the Australian Centre of Excellence for melanoma imaging and diagnosis, which has a $10 million grant from the Australian Cancer Research Foundation. So that Vectra software will enable us to see each individual mole, and the software will essentially virtually excise each mole and arrange it in a series according to size or colour, or whichever sequence we prefer, to enable assessment and to identify any outliers. And then you can have different images taken at 2 different time points and can compare and look for any changes. So the software is fit with a change detection module, which will enable us to see if any lesions have changed. They'll also pick up changes in underwear and that sort of thing, which is not useful, but I think this sort of software will continue to get better. And at the moment, it doesn't have any artificial intelligence in terms of diagnostics inbuilt, and that's one of the challenges, I think, to come. So where are we in terms of artificial intelligence for skin cancer diagnostics? Well, the dermatology world went into a bit of a spin in February 2017 when this was published in Nature, and it showed essentially that an AI algorithm developed by the Stanford group could diagnose melanomas just as well as 20 board-certified dermatologists. And so there was a lot of excitement about this, and a lot of dermatologists felt a little bit threatened that we might all of a sudden be out of a job. There was an article then by a German group who used the Google architecture as well to develop their own AI system, and showed that also that it performed very well compared to dermatologists. So there was a flurry of papers about this, and still a lot of work going on. The International Skin Imaging Collaboration was developed and really led by a group at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and each year is putting up a challenge to see who can come up with the best algorithm to diagnose a whole bank of images that they've collected from multiple different centres across the world. So there's a lot of interest in this space worldwide. There's been a lot of interest in diagnostic tools over many, many years. So it's really interesting, I think, and important for us to put this in context. And there's been a huge amount of money that's been put into developing diagnostic tools, using lots of different technologies that do not integrate artificial intelligence necessarily. So just bringing this sort of technology from the experimental phases into the clinics is an important consideration. And to date, the recommendations in the guideline is really that there is no good evidence for the use of diagnostic tools as a diagnostic aid in general practice. And we did discuss that recommendation at the last guidelines meeting last year in the light of all of this new evidence with artificial intelligence, and the decision was not to change that recommendation at this stage, but I suspect over the coming years that that will be upgraded. So the current challenges for clinical implementation, there are a number of them, I think, and I've listed some of them here, although I'm sure that I haven't included all of them. And so I think interesting to discuss this with the group, and very interested to take questions later. But a couple of the key things is generalizability. So I think thinking about the appropriateness of the training data sets is really important, and what that means for regulatory approval. So if there is a fantastic algorithm that's developed on data in the US, is it going to be appropriate to bring that to Australia for use in our specific population? You know, we have slightly different risk in Australia. We've got much higher risk, in fact, of melanoma. We've got a very large group of actinopaths, patients with a lot of skin and sun damage, and potentially means that algorithms that were developed in the US population, it might not be as accurate or as appropriate to use here. Accuracy in the clinical setting. So we can see some really good studies showing pretty impressive accuracy in the experimental setting, where dermatologists are just looking at an image and asking for their diagnosis. And I can tell you that it's very different looking at a photograph as opposed to looking at the patient in clinic, and also the interaction with the patient is really important, what their concerns are, how anxious they are about a certain lesion, and what their history is and what their family history is, or their experiences to date with the healthcare system, in fact. So there are a whole lot of things that feed into how you might interact with the patient, and how AI might affect that. Transparency. So how did the AI arrive at its diagnosis? And there was a really interesting paper in Nature again last year, published by Philip Shandell, looking at different types of AI outputs, and looking at the collaboration really between the users, the dermatologists, and the AI. And they decided to develop an algorithm that had some glitches in it on purpose, to see if even experienced dermatologists might be misled by an algorithm that they previously developed trust in. And they found that most of the dermatologists did, in fact, were susceptible to being misled by an algorithm that had some inbuilt glitches. So I think that's really important for us to understand. And so how can we make the AI more transparent so that we are able to trust it and to understand how it arrived at its diagnosis? What sort of output styles are going to help us best? So some output styles might be that they provide a benign or malignant diagnosis, and that's it. Or they might give us a probabilistic diagnosis where they provide a list of potential diagnoses and a probabilistic score next to each. So I think there's some of the main considerations, and I'll just go through a few of the studies that we've done to highlight some of those points. So this is, I suppose, just looking at some of the data that is available and that's been used to develop AI algorithms to date, that have been published to date. And a lot of data banks will include single time point images. So images of single lesions that have been taken because they've been interesting for some reason, and they are variably labelled with a histopathology diagnosis or just a clinical diagnosis from the treating doctor. And so it's not particularly standardised, the imaging that's been used over the years. Obviously, there's been different forms of dermoscopy and different methods of taking dermoscopic imaging, and the labelling of these images is pretty variable as well. So what we aim to do with the what we've called the ACEMID project with the vector machines is to provide a more comprehensive data set with really standardized and reproducible imaging of each lesion and of the whole ecosystem of lesions within an individual, and also link that to their history and phenotype and potentially genetic data as well. We have looked at accuracy in the clinical setting using an algorithm that Zhongwan and the team developed for MolMap. MolMap is the industry partner in this study. And Claire Felmingham, who is our master's student, has done a fantastic job in really driving this study forward. But I just had some interesting examples to show you, which highlight some of the issues with the data, the training data set is really important to know whether it's appropriate to make certain diagnoses. So this is a sort of lesion that we see a lot in elderly people. It's a telangiectatic patch. It often confuses particularly younger registrars. I know I used to get confused by these patches when I was training. And interestingly, the algorithm called it malignant, and I suspect that's because it thought it was a superficial BCC, and sometimes clinically it is difficult to tell the difference, but this is pretty common benign telangiectatic patch. This, you may all have a look at this and know what it is. It's a bruise, but again, the AI thought it was malignant. So, but I suspect that the AI actually wasn't really trained on many bruises, so it's not really fair to show it. So it's just an illustration of lesions that, if it's not in the training set, it's not going to be particularly accurate. And the same with pimples. So this, the algorithm thought this pimple was a little bit suspicious, but I think most of you would be able to look at that and say, oh, it's just a pretty common ordinary pimple. And again, psoriasis can really mimic Bowen's disease, which is a type of squamous cell, superficial squamous cell cancer. But when you take a close, when you have a full picture of the patient's skin and see the psoriasis elsewhere, you know that this is also going to be psoriasis. But it was pretty good with melanocytic lesions, which is what it's been exposed to most. And there was some discrepancy between what the dermatologists thought and what the algorithm thought. The algorithm did tend to err on the side of caution, but may have in fact saved some unnecessary biopsies like this one. This was a metastatic deposit, which would have been easy to discern with the clinical picture, and a bit unfair to the algorithm that it's called it uncertain. So I think it's really important to be able, for the algorithm to be able to tell us when it is uncertain, so that we're not misled as well. This was a case that I saw actually that I got wrong, and I remember telling my registrar that melanomas are very uncommon in the dorsal hand, and I think sometimes we have our own thoughts about, we're biased in our own way from our own experience, and certainly I can count on a few fingers how many melanomas I've seen on the back of a hand, but this ended up being one of them. So the AI won on that occasion. So I think really interesting to know how we interact with AI, and Claire's doing some nice work looking at our preferences as clinicians and end users as to what's going to be most useful. So firstly, do we want the AI only when we request it on demand, or would we like it whenever we take a photo as a synchronous AI diagnosis? Will we kind of switch off and not think for ourselves if we get it in a synchronous way, or maybe it's safer to have it just on demand and after we've made up our own diagnosis already? And then what sort of outputs do we prefer? So before I showed you one that was just benign or malignant, you can see in the box there, and this one gives you a breakdown of a more probabilistic diagnosis, which some people may prefer. We've done some work, and Zhongwan and his team have done some really fantastic work looking at some of our sequential images. and building an algorithm that uses the sequential images rather than just a single time point image, and have shown that building an algorithm with the sequential images actually produces more accurate result than if it's developed just with those single time point images. And in fact, this is a bit of a confusing graph, but I'll just take you through it. So these are all malignant melanomas, each case from 1 through to 89. And the faint pink is when the diagnosis has been missed, and the grey is when the diagnosis is accurately called malignant. And there is a black diamond when the AI has called the lesion malignant. And in each series, for each lesion, there might be 4 or 5 up to 12 images that are in the sequence of time. So they might be imaged over several years, once a year, for example, for 12 images in total for some lesions. And so we're looking to see if the AI can diagnose melanoma any sooner in that sequence than we could. And for the most part, the AI was successful in doing that. So the AI got the correct diagnosis after the first or second image was taken. And a lot of the readers in this study took several images to come to the correct diagnosis. So potentially there are some biomarkers that we can look for in those early images to give us clues as to which lesions are more likely to progress and become malignant, which I think is really exciting. In that work, it was really interesting. So there were some lesions that were really easy to diagnose, and they're in the heat map you can see they're all coming out as green. So these there were 12 readers in the study, dermatologists and our trainees, and you can see their individual lesions down here. And there were some lesions that all of us got right, and they were all green, and some lesions that we all found difficult and we all got wrong up here in the pink.
I think we lost Tori.
I think we've just lost Professor Ma.
Yeah.
We'll just give it a few minutes for her to return. In the meantime, we have some wonderful questions from the audience already in the chat box. Please, if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to share. Certainly, I'm learning a lot from this presentation, and as someone who works predominantly in eyes, I'm quite grateful that we're working in eyes and not skin, given I feel comparatively there's much less variation compared to skin lesions. We'll just give it a few minutes for Professor Ma to hopefully reconnect. I think we have some wonderful questions from the audience as well, in particular to the generalizability of these models which are being built in different different populations, particularly ethnicity, and the impact on the pigmentation of the skin. There's some wonderful questions around as well around workflow, how AI might be integrated into clinical practice, and the implications on screening as well as clinical practice workflows. And lastly, I think there's a group of questions on the type of imaging which could be used for AI diagnostics, whether photography in itself is sufficient, particularly mobile photography, or would there be application for subsurface imaging like OCT, which is very well validated in eye disease or confocal microscopy. Here we are, and we've got Professor Ma back.
Sorry, everybody. Can you hear me?
No worries. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what happened to the hospital internet then. Can you just allow me to share?
Yeah, I've just done that, so hopefully that'll work.
Yeah, sorry, everyone.
No worries.
Okay. Yes, so there were some lesions that that we all found easy, that the algorithm found hard, and they tended to be small lesions and lesions that had, you know, a less well-defined border. So that was an interesting exercise. And I thought it was also interesting. So we all put down how confident we were about a particular diagnosis for each lesion, and graded that. And then we could also determine from the probabilities that the algorithm gave how confident it was about its diagnoses. And for the ones that we were somewhat confident, not particularly confident about, I think the algorithm was doing quite a bit better than us, actually. Which was pretty interesting. So how can we improve diagnostic accuracy? And we've had a few ideas about this. And the first, I think, that's really interesting is to think about using and incorporating different data sets and different data types. So we know that if we have a lesion that's a bit unusual, and we cut it out and send the lesion to the pathologist who looks at it, it's always nice to give them a bit of information about the dermoscopic or about the clinical picture, and sometimes I'll send the photographs and the dermoscopic image to the pathologist, which is quite helpful. And so the question is, well, is that useful for the AI when we're developing AI? Would it be provide us with a more accurate answer if it's got inputs from both the histopathology image data as well as the dermoscopic image data? And would that be more accurate than if we present it with either the histopath or the dermoscopic image alone? And then, of course, you could add in additional data types, different biomarkers, and potentially some genetic information as well. The other interesting thing would be to look at identification of computer-generated biomarkers, using really the sequential images and longer-term follow-up of individual lesions. So they're the types of things that we're interested in. And then, as well as diagnostics, I think we really have to think of the broader picture of how we screen for melanoma, because there is a lot of ad hoc screening that's going on at the moment, and I think we could do things a little better by being a bit more targeted. And currently, the way that we determine an individual's risk is a little bit subjective as well. And so, using some of the 3D imaging data, we can actually develop a more objective risk score for patients, and provide a more sort of targeted approach for people with at higher risk of developing disease. So that was the end of my presentation. I'd like to really thank everybody that's worked hard on these projects. I've got photos there of Jen Nguyen, who was doing the sequential project together with Zen and Zhongwan, and a photo of Claire Felmingham, who's worked on the SMARTY trial, and a list of collaborators there, which have been really fantastic to work with. So thanks everybody for your time, and happy to have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Ma, again, for sharing that wonderful research. That was truly fascinating, and you know, it certainly was very enlightening in terms of your progress, but also the challenges of incorporating AI into dermatology. We have from the audience a wonderful set of questions already, so let's get started. I think the first question from Awad was, do these models work on a multi-ethnic population, and what is the implication of applying? I know you spoke earlier to some of the challenges with generalizability. Are you able to give us a sense of where we're up to with this technology and how it performs in different ethnicities?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really important question, and absolutely is why it's important to consider where the data has been, how the algorithm has been trained, and where it's been trained, and on what sort of population. But currently, I mean, most skin cancer does arise in fair-skinned individuals, and so there will be certainly predominance of people with fair skin, and far fewer people with darker skin types. So that's certainly an issue. And then there will be certain melanomas that are more common in some skin types. For example, acral melanoma is much more common in Asian populations, and the algorithm, for example, the MolMap algorithm has probably seen fewer acral lesions than perhaps algorithms developed elsewhere where those lesions are more common. So really important consideration, I think.
Fantastic. My next question from Blake Mumford was around medico-legal implications. Certainly, it sounds like from what you described today that AI could be quite disruptive for dermatology clinical practice. The question, which was, how many dermatologists would, for example, not biopsy a lesion when the AI reports a malignancy with a high degree of confidence?
Yeah, so I mean, the medico-legal risks have been something that I think dermatologists have been worried about for a while, and not just with this technology, but with technologies that have preceded it. I think with any diagnostic tool or aid, it still comes down to the treating doctor to make the final decision, and so I think it's really important to continue to question, why has the AI come up with that diagnosis? And if there is still some suspicion, then, you need to biopsy that lesion. The issue is how the interaction will go with the patient. And I think that's really interesting, because if you have a lesion that you're worried about, in your gut you're worried about, and you have an AI diagnosis that comes back as benign, and the patient is then very reluctant to have a diagnostic biopsy, how do you navigate that? And so I think we sort of need to develop a bit of a framework as to how we use it, and some guidelines for implementing it safely. But I think it hasn't been tested sufficiently in the clinical practice to understand some of those safety issues. And so I know just from the Smarty trial, there have been some situations where we've changed our mind because we've got the AI diagnosis back, and usually it makes us nervous. So we say, oh, okay, we'll biopsy it, we won't monitor it. But yeah, I mean, I think these are the questions that we need to develop some answers to, and some frameworks for people so that they can navigate that a little bit more clearly.
I think one of your slides, which I particularly liked, was the one around the AI-human interaction. And I think these tools, these technologies don't operate in isolation. They operate, within this clinical context with humans and opinions. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
The next group of questions, Professor Ma, is actually around imaging technologies as well. And this also relates to models of care. You mentioned, potentially using mobile phones earlier in addition to AI. Do you think that is sufficient for screening for conditions like melanoma? Do you think we will get to the point where smartphone diagnostics plus AI would be sufficiently accurate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, because there are already smartphone applications out there that claim to be able to diagnose melanoma. And so I think it's going to create some headaches for the regulatory authorities to be able to, regulate these sorts of technologies coming through, but they are in fact available. So whether or not the use case is for, patients to be able to do that themselves at home, I think it's something that we all feel a bit uncomfortable with. Oftentimes a patient will come in with a spot that they're concerned about, and then, and it's something completely benign, but we'll look on their back and they'll have an obvious melanoma. So, you can have something at home, but you've also got to know what to image and what to be concerned about. So I suppose patient-led surveillance, patient-led diagnosis concerns me to a degree, unless there is some link back to the clinic. So we're doing a trial at the moment, which is patient-led surveillance using a handheld dermoscope that they hook onto their phone at home. And then they take an image between appointments and send it back to a dermatologist to have a look at. and we provide feedback and say that's okay, it can wait till your next visit, or no, you need to come in sooner. And so you can imagine that that might become an AI role rather than a teledermatology role. But I think a lot of work needs to be done before that would be, recommended or considered.
Wonderful. I'm conscious of time, and I know sort of where we're coming close on time. Maybe perhaps we'll do 2 more questions, if that's okay with you, Professor Ma, before we wrap up. The next question is around novel sort of imaging techniques, particularly subsurface imaging, OCT, confocal microscopy, or even hyperspectral imaging. What's your view on applying those technologies to AI?
Yeah, well, I think confocal microscopy together with the histopathology and the dermoscopic imaging would be really great, and I've been meaning to talk to Zhongwan about that because because I think it'd be really cool. But yeah, so we have a confocal microscope that we use in clinic, and it can be challenging just from a workforce perspective in training someone up to be able to use that properly. It is very operator dependent. And so having some AI decision support to help with assessing some of those images that the confocal gives us would be really useful in terms of just workforce support, actually. But yeah, I think having when we're talking about using multiple different data sets to improve the diagnostic accuracy, then that would be another one to put into the mix for sure.
And my very final question before we let you go, Professor Ma, this conversation has been so enlightening. Is there are many parallels, in fact, between dermatology and ophthalmology. One is often a lack of a sufficiently trained clinical workforce, or insufficient access to clinical workforce. And you mentioned earlier at the start of your presentation a lack of population-based screening for skin cancer as well. I suppose my final question is, if you could peer into our crystal ball, what would your ideal, I suppose, model of care be for dermatology or for skin cancer, incorporating these novel technologies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I think at the moment my feeling is that there is too much screening going on, and I spend a lot of my time counselling patients that they actually don't need to be seeing me quite so often as they do. There's a lot of anxiety around skin cancer, and for good reason in this country, I think. But I think it's very hard for patients to understand their own risk. So I think the first thing is developing a really objective risk model that patients can get a much clearer picture of their risk, and then streaming those people into risk stratified sort of surveillance programs as needed. And I think a large chunk of people could be reassured very safely that they don't require ongoing routine skin checks, and there will be a fraction of people who are at high risk who will need more frequent consultation. And then I think combining total body imaging with AI diagnostic support to flag any lesions that require further assessment. And I think that would be clinical assessment still by a dermatologist or a skin cancer doctor for ongoing either surveillance or biopsy. But I think we'll probably use a combination of tools depending on the patient's background risk, and so determining that background risk is going to be equally important, I think.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time again, Professor Ma. This has been a wonderful conversation. For everyone, this discussion has been recorded, so you can revisit it at a later point. We will be having another one of these workshops in about 4 to 6 weeks' time. I look forward to seeing you all there. But for today, thank you so much again, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Tori.
Thanks, Songman. Bye.
Bye.